Hello and welcome. This is going to be a new educational series, and I'm going to go over everything that's related to physique development, whether that's training, nutrition, supplementation, or any other thing that could be of interest. The reason for this series is because although I like a lot of the short content, it is not really that good to get a complete overview of different topics. There are simply some things that you can't just get to understand in 30 seconds or less. Also, as you'll see today, it's a lot more nuanced than you may think, and it's not that black and white as it often is portrayed to be. We're going to start off with fatigue. But what really is fatigue? Now, this is something that has gained a lot of popularity, especially on TikTok in the last year or so. But when people talk about fatigue, I think they often think of something that is not really the fatigue that we're talking about. When we think about fatigue, we should differentiate between two different kinds of fatigue. So we have psychological fatigue, which is what most people think of fatigue as. So that is the feeling of drowsiness and being tired. But what we're actually going to be talking about today is physiological fatigue. So that is the fatigue that your muscles and nervous system experience, and especially in relationship to exercise. So now we have that in its way. What is physiological fatigue exactly? Fatigue is actually just a decrease in muscular performance. There can be different reasons for this. And usually we have two categories of fatigue in a broad term. We have CNS fatigue, or central nervous system fatigue, and we have peripheral fatigue. So we'll start with CNS fatigue. And when we're talking about CNS fatigue, it's mostly something called supraspinal fatigue. Now, supraspinal CNS fatigue is just one part of CNS fatigue. We also have something called spinal fatigue. But there's not that much to talk about in spinal fatigue, and it's still an ongoing area of research, and there's a lot of things that we don't know. So we'll focus on supraspinal CNS fatigue. And this is basically just everything going around inside your brain, where spinal fatigue is, everything going around in your spine. So the study of fatigue is actually several hundred years old. Already in the 19th century, researchers found out that lactic acid is associated with a decrease in muscular contraction. Now, this research was mainly done in frog models. But what was found at the time was that lactic acid, or acidosis in the body, is usually correlated with bad muscular performance. But as we'd later discover, lactic acid isn't the only contributor to fatigue. It's actually just a very small part of it. Now, later in the 1970s and 1980s, we had a new hypothesis. This was called the energy crisis hypothesis. So what this hypothesis says is that fatigue is a result of not enough ATP production inside of the muscles. And this hypothesis has gained a lot of popularity, and a lot of researchers actually still believe it. But it has been debunked, because now we know that you can't actually decrease your ATP levels substantially. If you do this, you will undergo necrosis and your muscles will die. So what we know today is that fatigue is actually a mechanism designed to make sure that we can't deplete our ATP levels enough. So this is the reason why we have a drop in performance, is to make sure that we physically can't be able to get low enough ATP levels to undergo necrosis and kill ourselves. So with that underway, what is CNS fatigue? CNS fatigue is caused by a lot of afferent inputs. Now, these are inputs from all throughout your body. So this could be burning sensations inside your muscles. This can be respiratory distress. So basically you're breathing heavily. This could be an increase in heart rate or blood pressure. It can be a lot of things. But these afferent inputs, or inputs from your periphery to the nervous system, is what is causing the accumulation of fatigue. And the result of this fatigue, you might ask, we can actually measure it. So our muscles have something called a voluntary activation deficit. Now this means that our muscle cannot voluntarily contract with every single fiber of its being. But we can bypass this. If we put electrical stimulation on certain muscles, we can get it to shortcut the central nervous system and contract with its full capacity. This means that we can get a measure of both voluntary activation and involuntary activation. So voluntary activation is just the most amount that you can voluntarily activate your muscles. Now, muscles do have differences in the amount that you can voluntarily activate them. Usually, bigger muscles have larger voluntary activation deficits. So we do see that muscles such as the quadriceps can probably only activate about 85%, whereas smaller muscles such as the biceps, it's more around those like 97, maybe even 98%. So CNS fatigue is just measured in the drop in voluntary activation, because our central nervous system dictates how much we can activate our muscles. So I talked about some of these afferent inputs, so things like respiratory distress. And this is one of the reasons why so many people are talking about you need to do low rep sets, because high rep sets will cause more fatigue. Now, this is actually true, but again, there's a difference between theory and application. And what we see in studies is that there's no real difference in hypertrophy outcomes between 5 and 30 reps. So although theoretically there is going to be a certain limit, we don't actually know how much of an impact that is going to have, and it's probably negligible. We just don't know with the data set that we have as of now. Okay, but is there other things that cause CNS fatigue? Yes, there is. There's many things that cause CNS fatigue. So CNS fatigue, or more specifically supraspinal fatigue, is everything that's going around in the brain. So a lot of what influences CNS fatigue is neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters are basically just chemical signals that will either increase or decrease the amount that your brain cells will communicate with each other. So you have excitatory neurotransmitters and you have inhibitory neurotransmitters. And these will either increase or decrease the total amount of brain activity. Now, one of the most acknowledged neurotransmitters that do play a big role in CNS fatigue is serotonin. So serotonin is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So this means that when we increase serotonin, muscle performance usually drops. We do see an increase in serotonergic activity when we're doing exercise. But we're not only interested in serotonin. There are plenty of other neurotransmitters that do play a vital role. So another neurotransmitter that's really important is going to be dopamine. You've probably heard about dopamine. It has a vital role in both motivation, behavior, and motor control. And what we look at often in CNS fatigue is the relationship between serotonin to dopamine. So the more serotonin you have, the more fatigued you're going to be, and the more dopamine you have, the less fatigued you're going to be. Dopamine is critical for motor control. And you see this often in patients with Parkinson's. This is a prime example. So people with Parkinson's usually have a deficit of dopamine production. This leads to something called dyskinesia, or basically just problems with moving and not really being able to control your muscles in the way that you want to. So lack of dopamine is really going to be detrimental to muscle ability. Now, another neurotransmitter that is also not that talked about, but pretty important, is something called GABA. Now, GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, is another inhibitory neurotransmitter. So again, when this increases, we will have more fatigue. Like with serotonin, we do see that when you exercise, the amount of GABA in your brain increases exponentially. But we do have some solutions for this. It has been shown that having more carbohydrates can decrease the amount of intraset GABA concentrations, especially in certain areas of the brain. Now, if this is clinically relevant is still a debate, but theoretically, carbohydrates should assist in this. One way I really like to think about GABA and the effects that it has on the body is when you think about alcohol. Now, the reason alcohol makes you tired is because it acts on GABA receptors. Okay, now we'll look at the last neurotransmitter. So this is going to be glutamate. And glutamate is one of the primary neurotransmitters of the brain. And this is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Now, glutamate is not directly influenced that much by exercise, but it is indirectly influenced. So when we exercise, we'll have an increase in the production of ammonia. Now, in the body, this is no problem because we have the liver and it can create a urea cycle where we recycle the ammonia into urea. But we have a problem because the brain does not have a liver and it cannot produce this urea cycle, so it needs an alternative mode. Now, what the brain does is that it takes ammonia and mixes it with glutamate, the neurotransmitter, and makes glutamine. This way, we can get the glutamine out of the body and we don't have any ammonia to be worried about. But the problem is that this decreases our total pool of glutamate, which is again going to drive CNS fatigue. Another thing that ammonia also does is that it alters a muscle's pH. So it makes the muscle more acidic, which do have some implications in peripheral fatigue, which we'll come into. But again, like with GABA, we do have studies that show that supplementation with glucose or just having extra carbs around the workout perimeter will decrease the amount of ammonia production. Okay, now we'll talk about the last thing on CNS fatigue. So when we exercise, we'll also damage some muscle tissue. And when we damage muscle tissue, there will be an inflammatory response to try and heal this muscle tissue. And some of these inflammatory cytokines are associated with a decrease in performance. Now, this is specifically a cytokine called interleukin-1 beta. Now, the mechanism of action is still not quite clear, but we do know that if you inject interleukin-1 beta directly into the brain, you will get a feeling of drowsiness and performance will not be as high. We also know that more muscle damaging exercises will increase interleukin-1 beta more than less damaging exercise. And again, we have data that shows that carbohydrates can offset some of the inflammatory markers associated with muscle damage. Okay, so this is basically everything you need to know about CNS fatigue. So now let's talk about peripheral fatigue. So what is peripheral fatigue? So peripheral fatigue is everything going on inside the periphery. So this is inside of your muscle cells. From the neuromuscular junction, this is where the central nervous system ends and where the muscle begins. So like with CNS fatigue, there is a lot of mechanisms going on in peripheral fatigue, and we don't really have to know every one of them. But there are some few highlights to mention. So one thing is reactive oxygen species. So when we exercise, we increase the amount of reactive oxygen species. Now these will go on and destroy certain bits of the muscle. And again, like we talked about, this will create an inflammatory response. But this is not what we're looking for here in peripheral fatigue. But what it also does is that it destroys some of the muscles and it can actually pull certain muscle structures apart. Now this makes the muscle very dysfunctional and some processes can't work as efficiently when they're pulled apart. So this causes a decrease in the sensitivity to calcium. And as we know, we need calcium for the muscle to contract. So if we have a decreased sensitivity, we need more calcium to get the same amount of muscle contraction. And this is actually a problem because more calcium is also going to negatively impact muscle performance. When we have too much calcium inside of our muscle, it will activate something called proteases. So these are enzymes that are destroying certain proteins. And these proteases, certainly one type of protease called calpain, will again go on and destroy more muscle. So this is actually just a loop where you get reactive oxygen species to destroy certain parts of the muscles. This will make the muscle less sensitive to calcium, so you'll have to produce more calcium to get the same muscle contraction, and then you'll have more protein-destroying enzymes that will destroy further bits of the musculature. And all of this at the same time will also produce CNS fatigue from the inflammation that is going to occur. Another thing about peripheral fatigue is that a lack of energy substrates, so primarily glycogen, is going to accelerate every single mechanism of action of peripheral fatigue. So this was basically just a quick tour about some of the most important things about fatigue. There will always be more to discuss, but if you know this, there's not really that much more that is necessary to know.